As I mentioned, my name is Shahed Chowdhuri, and I work for Excella Consulting. The topic here is Entity Framework Code First Migrations. And this is actually based on a project that Ed and Sahil and Dohan and myself have worked on at a client together. And I presented this formally at Microsoft Code Camp earlier this year. This is an extended version of the same presentation with more material, lessons learned, things you can troubleshoot with, and additional topics. Wanted to come up with a witty subtitle for this. Couldn't think of anything, so this is the best I could do. Don't drown in database design during development. Anyone who's worked on a .NET application with a database backend, with existing developers, new developers coming on, other dev teams working together, will realize that there's a lot of pitfalls that you can avoid. There's also a lot of lessons you can learn. So there's my blog right there, wakeupandcode.com. I'll mention at the end of the slides again. I have a download section there. When you get home, you can just click on the Downloads tab and download this presentation, and also the sample code that I'll be showing during the presentation. And I have my Twitter handle there, @ShahedC, my first name and last initial. So you can contact me directly on there as well. So I'd like to thank our sponsors. These are all the logos that I've pulled out the caparea.net website. You can see my employer, Excella Consulting, right there. And Caparea is at the bottom. They've been doing this for over 10 years. Great place to come, and welcome. So first, I'd like to check how many of you have used certain technologies that relate to Entity Framework and migrations. Yeah.
I have. Did you say, repeat your question?
Oh, yes. I'd like to check how many of you have used Entity Framework and related. So one person raised their hand. I actually have several questions here. So the first question is, how many of you have used ASP.NET MVC before? All right, very good. And how many of you have used Entity Framework before? All right, there's half the people here. And how many of you have done code first development here? All right. And finally, how many of you use migrations within EM? All right, just a couple of hands there. It's really good. What I'd like to see here is if you've used it before, I might ask you what kind of issues you've seen. If you haven't used it before, hopefully you'll learn a lot of new things today. And those of you who have been around the Code Camp version of this presentation, you'll see more things here as I've extended the presentation. So first, an introduction. So when we build an enterprise.NET web application, the simplest version of this is we have our web app, we're connecting to a database. But how exactly should we do it? There are so many ways of building an enterprise web app that we don't have one single strict way of developing. And you can even get started using, let's say, Hibernate on something and switch over to Entity Framework and build your project. So during the course of your development cycles, you'll notice that there's no single way of doing it, but once you get down the path of building a mature application, you really have to stick around and use what you've built and not start from scratch halfway through the project. So this will help you learn a couple of the lessons that I've learned myself with my colleagues, and will help you understand how we can apply this to real-world problems. So some of the options and alternatives that I'll be looking at today are using database first. So those of you who've used EDMX data model, it's fairly easy to create one from an existing database. So has anyone used EDMX before? All right, very good. So as you know, you can literally go inside Visual Studio, right-click on your project, and create a new EDMX data model of your entire database. Option B is model first. I don't usually recommend this. You can use a visual designer to create everything. Again, if you're going with code first, it's the opposite of that, and it doesn't give you a lot of control. It's like if you were building a website or web application and you're using front page to create your HTML page. It's just not going to work. Option C, code first, and option D, code first manual migrations. I've split this up because you can actually use migrations without having to automatically set up your database each time. You can manually have control. Now, the reason option D I feel is better is because you have full control of how you want your migration set up, and you can have database versioning and other things that are purposefully injected in the process of software development. So on to the first option. So using the EDMX model, it's fairly simple. You have your database, as I mentioned. Your database updates the EDMX data model, and you have your application code, which uses the data model. So if something changes in the database, that happens independently of your development cycle. Someone else could run a script on your database, add a new field, add a couple of tables, even drop columns. And your application won't even know that it's there until you see it during runtime. So it's still pointing to the old EMX. And someone goes around and updates your data model. And then your application breaks, because now you have to update your code to work with the new data model. So the way to generate that would be, as I mentioned, you right-click on your solution, you add into the data model. Seems simple. You have, let's say, one table with 2 fields in it. And let's say on the left here, you see you add a new description field. And the next time you update the model from the database, you can right-click within your VUMX and update your model and automatically add a white description. So again, this has a lot of pitfalls. It's not the ideal way of developing application in the long run. Any questions so far?
Why is that not ideal? Why is that not ideal?
Okay, so the question there was, why is that not ideal? So what happens is, if you have multiple developers working on the same project, and your database architect decides that there's going to be a bunch of new columns and new fields that needs to go into the database. Let's say there was a business decision that happens. One developer is on vacation, other developers are in the office, they've heard about it. Someone goes ahead and updates the database and develops it. Now, everyone might be pointing to the same shared database. They might have a copy of the database on their own machine. Let's say the server version gets updated, and your local version may or may not have been updated. You might have to ask the database guy for a script to update your database. So a lot of things become out of sync. So what I'm going towards is showing you these alternatives that you may have used and ways to solve these problems of getting out of sync. So really, it's the solution is to make sure that when something happens, it's deliberate and that everyone's aware. Does that answer your question? All right. So option B, I'm not going to dwell too much on this. As I mentioned, you can use the visual designer to create things that automatically create stuff behind the scenes. I'm not very friendly with this option, so I'm just going to move over to the next one. So I mentioned option C and D were pretty similar. So I'm going to jump ahead to one slide and show you this. The difference is that red part that says the migration code manually updates the database. And that's the only difference here. So here you have your application code that updates, that uses your .NET models. And I mentioned here, they're hand-coded. And this is where you start to create all your entities that exist in your database. Let's say you're developing a hospital system where you have your patient records, you have your list of hospitals, everything that's a table in your database will be created as a .NET model, a class, if you will, in your code. And using Entity Framework migrations, you can then use those models to generate the migration code. So once you do that, it allows you to inspect what's been automatically generated. It allows you to manually update that code so that if you wish to change something, and I'll explain later on why you would change something that's automatically generated. And you can then update your database, which would take your migration code, generate SQL code, and actually update your database. So you don't have to take a look at the SQL, but you're allowed to see what kind of SQL it generates. And this comes in handy when you want to fine-tune how your database gets generated. I'll also cover in this presentation what you would do if you had an existing database, because a lot of you might be working with existing systems. Yes, you had a question?
Just a question. If you had a table populated with data and you go through and you push this across, will you lose the data? Do you have to export the data, then push the changes, a schema mod?
It depends. So it depends on how the data got there. So let's say if a table is being dropped during the migration, you can actually drop a database table as well. If you're dropping the table, yes, you would lose that data. But if you were to intentionally drop something, you don't want the data anyway. If you're adding a column, you need to, you know that there might be data in there that you would need. In that case, you could set it up in 2 ways. You can set up what's called seed data, which I'll also get into, and that can be coded into your migration as well. And that'll keep that'll refresh data or insert new data, that's lookup data, into your system. And even if you don't have seed data, if some existing data exists in your database, this will be running SQL scripts to not do something destructively necessarily. Let's say if you add a new column, that won't create a scenario where you lose data. If you just delete a column, then you would lose data. So anytime you do something intentionally with the option of losing the column or losing a table, then you would know you're losing something. But otherwise, you're not going to lose your data. So now you have the last option, which is what I'll go into detail on. So as you notice, the last piece says manually updates. Now, what do you think we want to manually control when our database gets updated? Anyone?
No surprise.
Yes, no surprises. So if you want to manually update something, you don't want surprises. Now the surprises are not just for you, it's for everyone else that you work with. So the project that this came out of that I worked on, we had a project ourselves that we worked with. We had additional developers who were in other teams that were remotely located as well, who also hooked into the same database. We had existing tables in the database. We had new tables we were also adding to the model. So all the model code that we had didn't match the database entirely. There were database tables that existed which didn't have entity framework models in the code. Now the way we're able to do that is because when we run migrations, it keeps track of database versioning history. And we'll get into the migration history as well. So you might be asking, why would I want to do this? What exactly are we trying to solve? So the problem I'd like to solve here, and hopefully you are too, is to prevent the tug of war between yourself and other people you work with or even work against in some cases. If you have worked with a database administrator or a database designer, architects and other developers, you might know that some people would like to create a database with certain conventions. So let's say you want to have a table with a certain convention, a format for the way you name things, and someone else might want to have a different way of doing things. This allows you to actually create these models in your code that are differently named than the database tables that are in the database. And I'll show you how to do that as well. So you can map your, let's say, your patient records table to a different entity that's called something different. Doesn't have to be the same name. Or you could have a legacy database that has really cryptic table names that are in all caps with 8 characters. Maybe every letter stands for something. You don't have to name your objects the same way when you design your system. So here are the different problems we've got. So that's your dev team right there in the middle. On one side you have the database architects. They're trying to design this whole system for you because you work in this big enterprise. On the other side you have the database administrators. They would like to keep existing data in the production system. They don't really care how you do things in development, but they realize that in the next production release, you're going to have so many migrations that all the SQL code has to be applied to your database. And you might have indexes and foreign keys and other constraints that they want named a certain way. Maybe they want a clustered index for one thing. Maybe they want a primary key here. You have to conform to all of that. Because you could have the best application ever running in your machine. And it's no use if you can't deploy it to production. So on the other side, you have your dev team X and dev team Y. These are other people who might be developing parts of the same application, or even just hooking into the database, adding new tables. Now, have you ever seen this t-shirt that says, it works on my machine? So it's a popular developer t-shirt that I've seen. It works on my machine, what do I care? But you should, because once you go into production, and if nothing works, you don't have a job. And this is why we do Agile and Scrum development, because you don't have any surprises. You can have a mock server that looks exactly like production. You may not even have a production release for 12 months straight, but that doesn't mean you need to have a 12-month sprint. If you have 2-week sprints or even 4-week sprints, you can develop your application, deploy it completely in a server environment that looks and acts just like your production environment. All right? Any questions about this so far, or anyone want to share any conflicts or issues that they've had at work?
How does this work if the administrator is the other one who are creating all the database tables?
Yes, that's a good question. So the question was, how does it work if the administrators are creating all these database tables? So when you're working in a smaller group where you're developing an application and you're only adding, let's say, 10 or 20 tables in the course of this development. And the administrator wants to add some additional tables. So the first thing you'd have to do is figure out when you can talk to this person, because if he's just adding tables, there might be a reason he must be adding it. It could be some auditing tables, it could be for another project that's not set to come on board many months later. It may not even be part of your project. So if it is part of the product that you're developing, then you should have to add models for it in your database and include that in your sprint designs. And if it's something that doesn't relate to your set of models at all, you don't have to add it right away. You can leave it out there, and when your application interacts with the database, it doesn't care about all these additional tables that you'll never interact with. So either you have to add it, or if you don't need to add it, then you don't have to. So one breaker.
So when this creates the scripts, it actually checks the existing database to make sure the table doesn't already exist, and then create the scripts based on that? Or?
By default, the scripts that are generated just creates a new table. I'll get into it as well. So that's a good question. So the other question was that, does it check to see whether the table exists or not? So one of the problems we faced in the real world was, let's say our database had 100 tables, and we were just adding 20 more models for new tables. Every time we ran these migrations and scripts, we were updating our own local databases. We updated our shared development databases, and everything worked fine. But now we had the problem where we were updating, creating new models for tables that already existed. Someone else already manually added to the database. And if you generate a migration with that create table command, that will in turn generate a SQL code script that also says create table, and the script is not runnable. It won't run against an existing database. So what we had to do, and this was a necessary evil, where we generated a migration and we removed any create table statements or any statements that already applied to the database. So we wanted to make sure that we took away things from the migration, and if you really want to keep it in your source code history, you could comment it out. That way we know for a fact this is when I added the model to my database, to my code, but I couldn't use this part of the script because the table already exists. And so there are ways that we found around the problem, and it's not necessarily documented, but you yourself might find a different way of solving the problem. Does that answer your question? Right? So hopefully by the time you've done all this, you've gone through all this with your coworkers, you found a way to get along with everyone. But sometimes it just doesn't happen. You may have recurring conflicts. The way we found to get around this conflict was to have recurring meetings. So this is not, you can't just invite everyone around you to your daily Scrum meeting. That's supposed to be very short. So what we did was every sprint, we had an optional meeting where if anyone had a new migration added, if they had anything to add, if they had to communicate with these external teams, we met with the other folks. And we made sure that we were able to communicate. We have a new table coming out. Is everything good? And someone might raise their hand and say, please don't add a new table right now. This is what's going to break. We might say, we have to add this because so-and-so said we have to add this feature right now in this sprint. So then you can talk back and forth, and hopefully within that single meeting in a longer sprint, you're able to reconcile any disturbances. Okay?
Question.
Yes.
Could you create model from access file?
To your model from an access file, I have not done it personally. I wouldn't recommend access over SQL Server, but I don't know if you can. I've never used access with Entity Framework. Yes?
I couldn't find way.
Okay, does anyone else here used access with Entity Framework? I haven't done it personally myself, so I can't speak for it. Sorry about that. But I think if you want to talk to me afterwards, maybe we can figure out if there's some other ways around it. So here's the main agenda. I wanted to talk about these specific 6 processes, and after we cover this, I'll throw some hints about some additional items as well that you should definitely look into if you're doing migrations. So first, I'm going to go into the models and mapping. So here, you'll see on the right, I have the human class. So this is based on the patient record sample I was talking about. You have a list of people that are in your system, and it has an ID, which is going to be the primary key in the database. And you have your fields, you have an SSN, a first name, middle name, and last name. Through the example that I'll show you here today, what I'll show you is how can we update this model and have a database get updated, and what pitfalls can we expect to have. On the left here, you see a patient records DB context class. Now that's something that I just named to be consistent with this being a DB context, and the word DB context here comes from Entity Framework, which you have is using system.data.entity. Now, you'll also notice that I have a DB set here. So for every table you have in your system, you can define a DB set of that type. So right now, you don't have a database yet. All you have is an entity that has a couple of fields, and you have a DB set. Now, you might be wondering, well, what if I want to abstract some of this into a parent class? So something like the ID that might belong to every single entity. You could put it into a base class and everything will derive from it. So in my example, I only have one class, so it didn't make sense to make a base class, but you can do that. It's perfectly fine.
We did that. We did that. It worked out real well.
All right. Good to hear. And anytime you feel like you can relate to something, please feel free to speak up. Very good. So you would have a bunch of DB sets here added for every class that you have. Another thing you'll notice, I'm overriding a method here that's called onModelCreating. And I'm adding a human map. So that's also another custom class I have to define. It's of type entity type configuration, and it takes in the class that I've defined. So let me go through those. There's a lot of stuff to grasp here. So for every model that you define that will end up being a table in your database, we'll define one of these classes. And in my example, I put it into a model subfolder, so it's in a models namespace. And for every table, in your DB context, you will have a DB set. So humans, hospitals, and so on, doctors. Now the doctors aren't humans, of course, just locations. But there's a reason why I call it human. You'll see why. And the human map itself, as I mentioned, is also a custom class that you define. The constructor here has everything that it needs to set it up. So we're telling it that it has ID as its primary key, and the table itself maps to a table called humans, or this object maps to a table called humans. Now, what would happen if I didn't add this line here? What do you think Entity Framework will call the human table?
It automatically tries to pluralize the table name.
Yes, and what do you
sometimes
think?
it messes up.
It does. So in this case, it thinks the plural of man is men. So human becomes human. Unless you want a funny-looking table called human, you probably don't want that. So I added, and I found this by accident. I didn't realize that. So putting this line in there makes sure that it says humans.
Now, I may be getting ahead of you, but you're naming the ID as the key in the entity type configuration human map class rather than decorating the property in the...
That's correct. So there's two ways of setting up these properties.
I mean, you might be getting an annotation, so I don't want to
Yep, I
get
will.
into it.
So out of the 6 topics that I said, I won't be covering data annotations there, but there'll be 2 additional topics that I'll discuss after that. And I won't go into all the detail, but I will provide links where you can get more information. So the question here was, how about having data annotations? So you could have a key for this, and also you can restrict the string. Right now, these will become varchars, I think 256 or max or whatever's defaulted. We'll see it in the database implementation. And you probably don't want everything to be at the same width. It's really easy, and I'll show this to you in a later slide. You would have the string length attribute, and that will immediately create SQL code that generates the correct size string. Very good. Yes?
If you already have an entity framework all set up, can you generate these models and mapping files from that?
It depends. If you're already using EDMX, then no. If you're already doing, let's say, code first without migrations, then you can introduce migrations to a project.
Okay.
But it's better to, if we're starting from scratch, it's easier to make these kind of architectural decisions. Yes?
Something that helped me and understand this when I was learning was to use the feature that they call database first in the entity framework code first.
Yes.
They introduced that feature a little bit later. So they mapped an existing database for me, and I could tell what I should do then.
That's correct. So the question, or the comment here was that you can use database first and then auto-generate. So don't let that be an explicit guide for you. You can use it as a reference because you may not want to do everything that it generates for you. But it's a great way. Yes, Sam?
Yeah, one of the things that we found when Shahed and I were actually trying to do the same thing is that we found that occasionally it would mess up. Like it would take a relationship that was supposed to be one way and actually turn it into a bi-directional relationship. So you can trust it to show you the basics of how to do things, but you should handle relationships yourself.
Yes. Great. So if you notice here, I've actually left this blank. So it has one table. It doesn't have any relationships. It's a little lonely by itself here. So as soon as we get into the relationship part of it, we'll show how you can have two objects that can have relationships. Let's say if you have one-to-one, a human can contain, let's say, a car or an address or something else it contains. And on the flip side, if you have, let's say, an object that can contain multiple things, right? In the case of address example, let's say you have multiple addresses. You could have a collection of objects to represent something that something else contains. Yes.
Are you waiting for a scaffolding to build all the procs for the CRUDs? Do you go through the code generation as well for that?
No, everything that you see here, we're going to be generating ourselves. So the only thing we're going to be auto-generating is going to be the migrations, and we'll get to that shortly.
What about the procs themselves?
Oh, are you talking about store procedures?
Store procs. Are you
Yes.
waiting for a scaffolding on MVC to kind of build all those?
I won't get into store procedures here, but if you do have existing store procedures in your database, that won't be affected by any of this. You will have to then add them by yourself inside in the database. You won't be adding store procedures through migrations. You're only adding tables and the table records. There'll be an additional table that gets added. It's a metadata table. I mentioned earlier there's a migration history that gets stored with your database. It's called literally __ migration history. It's a system table, and it gets stored along with your database. But yeah, store procedures and views and other things that you add, you will have to add them as you normally do.
Some DBAs restrict you from doing any of this.
Right.
You have to go through their access back.
That's correct. So the comment here was some DBAs will restrict you from doing things like this. That's true. If your DBA and your organization does not support this, you're not going to get this off the ground. We did a lot of hand-wringing and throat choking, or whatever you call it, to get this off the ground. And once we could prove that it worked in our system, it went really well. All right. Slide 2, or part 2, connection strings. So this isn't really required for you to do this. We found this to be absolutely helpful. I actually created a blog post about this when I launched my blog, wakeupandcode.com. And for those of you who get this gaming reference, you should get it. All your databases belong to us. I won't explain what it means, but you can look it up. I'm going to explain how you can prevent yourself from stepping or shooting yourself in the foot when you have database strings all over the place. So a lot of you may have worked at places where you have a web config file that has your database credentials in the web config file. Just let me ask that as a question. How many of you have seen web config files with database credentials in the config? All right, I see a couple of hands going up there. I see more hands going. People smiling. Very good. We want to make sure we don't get into that. So what we found in our project was this was really useful. We were able to extract this out into another file. So in our web config, the entire connection strings block was reduced to a single property here. So config source is part of web config. You may have never used it, but if you do, all you have to put in there is the path and file name. It's easy to just leave the file name in there, because that way your file, connectionstrings.config. Yes, you had a question.
Finish your thought, sorry.
So the file connectionstrings.config can reside in the same folder as your web config. Yes?
Does that support web config transformations?
Yes, I'll be getting to that as well. So this doesn't relate directly to transformations, and you might be wondering, well, what about my transformations? So the way I've set this up is you'll notice it's called patient records DB content. This has the same name, and so it's not the default name. If it's custom name, it has to be the same as your database context. So when you set up Visual Studio, you all know about the starter project that you have for your web project. So as long as your web config has this in it, Visual Studio knows where to get the name of the DB context because you have that set in the starter project. The connection string, in this case, I have a local MDF file. This would normally be a connection string to whatever you're connecting to. Now I'll go into a little bit more detail on this to explain how each person on the development team can have their own copy of the database, because you don't want to be running migration of someone else's database. You're going to be really messing with it. You might be experimenting with new tables, you might be in the middle of something, you might even make a mistake and break your database. So this will allow you to have your own copy. And this is pretty self-explanatory, it says provide. So now, you might be wondering,
sorry, what is the advantage of bringing that up to such a file? It's still for text. What's the advantage of it?
So I'll explain to you the next time. So over here I have explained. So you might be wondering, well, how can I point to my own database? So as I just mentioned, each developer has their own connection strings that config. Let's say when I was working with other team members, I had my own copy, they had their own copy, we all pointed to our own copy of the database. That allowed us to run our migrations just on our database and not everyone else's. So the second question is, how do I avoid checking this into source control? Because now that you each have a different version of the same file, you definitely don't want to check this file into the system. So the trick to doing this is to remove the file from your project. So let's say in Visual Studio, you can right-click on any file and remove from project, and it disappears. And you have to click on the button that says Show All Files in your Solution Explorer just to see files that are not added. And if you wish to add something back, you can right-click on that non-added file and say Add to Project. So now the problem is, wait a second, I've removed the connection strings file from my project. How will the server deployments work? So someone had asked here, how about transformations? So the transformation will work as is. Let me go back here for a second. You notice here that I don't have any production information. I just have these local paths to my own database. So just as you have web config, if you're already using transformations, you will have a web.prod.config, web.debug.config, and so on. That will still work as is. And hopefully you're using continuous integration, something like TeamCity, to push all your deployments out. And as soon as you publish to a different configuration, it should be able to pick up the transformation. And what you need to do is make sure your transformation removes the config source and adds in the correct value. So as long as config source is removed and the correct value is added, none of this stuff matters. So connection strings and config is only for you and your developers. They'll never see the light of day on a production server or any deployed server. This is just there for you so you can have your own connection. So the last question here is, do I have to include credentials in the config? So the way we found a way around this is, if we go into the config file, we normally have all the credentials up here. So now it's just in another file. If we have all these additional config files for your production and deployment systems, how are you going to make sure that there are no credentials in there? So one way we found our way around this is we use machine access to SQL Server. So for any given environment, we knew what our database server was being called in production. We knew what it was being called in our mock environment and a UAT server and so on. So instead of having the full credentials, we just had the name of the database that it was pointing to. And on the database itself, we had our DB admin or ourselves. A lot of us had admin access. When you know how you go into SQL Server and you give permissions for specific users, if you use a $sign after a machine name, this is something we found out in the course of this project, you can actually give machine access. So in a production database, you make sure that only the production database web server has access to the production database. You still have your usual users as well, because obviously people will have to log in. But as long as you have machine access there as well, what you can do is you can deploy to a new environment and restrict the web server to access the database it needs to get to. Now this is not required. Again, it's something that's optional, but it's a way to make sure that you don't have to provide your credentials, because it then goes into your source control system, and with all the versioning history there, even if you take it out, it's always going to be there. So if you change your password, obviously it gets updated, but that's just not good practice. Does anyone have any questions or concerns about these approaches? Yes, question number one.
When you set the permissions on a database using a machine name, is that the SID, is that like the square identifier, or is that?
No, it's actual machine. So domain / / the machine name $.
Is that then the eligible or somebody who's changing the machine name to match?
The only way to change the machine name, you would have to have it on the domain as well.
Is
So-
that machine name already on it?
Right, you would only keep it for the existing machine that exists in your domain. So if someone is already on a domain, you wouldn't have people. I mean, if you have people coming into your network, adding a new machine that already exists, I mean, you have a big problem, right? Does that answer your concern?
Okay, maybe this is off topic, but you have two machines that are both already on the domain.
Yes.
You change the name. One of the machines has access to the database, one machine doesn't. Why does that other machine that's already on the thing change its name and not for
It is using the AD SID. When you add the machine to the domain in AD, it creates a SID for that machine name, and that's under the covers is what SQL Server is using as the identifier for the user.
So it is using this.
Yes.
All right, so that's thanks for explaining that. So basically, what we explained was that it still uses the SID underneath when you're adding the machine access to a SQL Server. So even just to add that, you'd have to be an administrator on the database itself. Okay. And if you have people on your team who are doing things like this, get them off your team. The next step here is to actually enable your migrations. So the way you do that is to literally run a command that says enable migrations. So where do you enter that? I'll get into that right here. If you look on the top, there's something called Package Manager Console. Does everyone here know how to pull up the Package Manager Console panel? All right, so when I do my demo, I'll show you how. It's under the tools. It's part of Visual Studio, and normally you use it for managing your packages, but here you're going to use it to enable migrations, add your migrations, update the database, and so on. So in the interactive demo that I'll show after this, I'll show how you can type in the command, put in the flag context type name, and then put in the namespace and the class name for your DB context. Now this is a one-time thing. You do this at the very beginning. One person can do this in your team. Once you have it set up and your code is checked in, everyone can then pull your code down and run the migration command to update their database. And if everyone's having their own copy of their database, you can also have a baseline where you've added a couple of things to the database so that the initial version of the database doesn't start clean. You can start with an empty database, or you can start with an existing database. For the most part, you may have an existing one, because as you're designing it, you'll probably have a few tables already. So as soon as you run this, it'll generate this configuration.cs file. When it generates this, it has this constructor here that has one property that's setting automatic migrations enabled equals false. We're going to leave this as false so that you can have full control over how you want to update your database. As someone mentioned here, we don't want any surprises. You'll also see the seed method. I've actually added this seed data myself. Normally, it puts in a commented block of code, which has an example of how you can add seed data. There's two things I want to highlight here. One is that I've mentioned SSN, and here I've set up all the fields that are there in my table. Now, who could tell me why I would mention an SSN to be the key when I already have an ID field that's supposed to be the primary key?
Can I change from, I guess, database to database?
Right. Now, no, so you're saying it might change from database to database? So your SSN is actually unique for a person, but your ID is what changes, right? So what will happen is, if I ran the seed data without this line over here, it would still work. It would add this John Doe with this SSN into my database. And next time someone runs update database on their system, it takes this migration and adds a migration, and it always runs the seed method. So the seed method runs every time. And what happens is, it still thinks your ID is the primary key, which it is, and it'll add another John Doe with the exact same SSN. So every time you run update database, you don't tell it what the unique key is, it's going to keep adding that data. So here's one way of getting around it. So the next step is to actually update your database. There's two steps to this. If you're added a migration yourself, you would be the person that adds the migration, and you can name it whatever you want. So let's say my human class only has a first name and a last name, and I haven't added the middle name yet. I can add a new migration and call it added middle name, and it's going to generate new migration code from my model code. Notice the direction of the arrow here. This is a one-way process. Once you have migration code, I mentioned you might be manually changing it because you want to change the output SQL, but you would never change migration code to affect your model. This is always a one-way process. If you want to add something new to your model, you would generate a new migration. Or if you haven't checked in your code yet for the day, you can regenerate this migration. You can delete it, add it again. That's not a problem. What you don't want to do is, if you've added a new migration and checked it in, and everyone else in your team has pulled that code, you don't want to go back and change an older migration. Unless there's something so minuscule that just has to be fixed in the previous migration, you don't want to add a new migration just to fix it. And you have clear understanding with all your team members that you are going to go in and change it, and they don't have any other pending migration they're about to add. Sure, you can go back and change that one thing, but normally you would never change a migration that's already been added in the sequence of things. So I mentioned the history, a list of different migrations. As this list starts to grow, you might be wondering about versioning, because you have this name right here. You might forget what you called your migrations. You might have two migrations with the same name. So typically you try to keep it as unique as possible. There's not a huge limit on, there's not a small limit on what you call it, but you don't have to worry about being absolutely unique because it's going to add a timestamp to the file name. Now we'll see in a minute where this all goes. The second part of this is to run the update database command. And they've kept this command really simple. When you add a migration, you run the add migration command. And when you update the database, you run the update database command. Notice the hyphens in all of them. And although I've used uppercase, lowercase, these are not case sensitive. It's just easier to look at. So the second part here changes your database. It adds things to it, it deletes from it. And I put the word SQL in here because it actually generates SQL. There's another step that I've left out because it is optional. By default, if you run update database, it takes your migration code, it takes your seed method and runs it. So it'll update your database with whatever is in the latest migration. And how does it know what version it's on? How does it know how to move up to the next version? That's where the migration history comes into play, and we'll see that in more detail in a couple slides. There's one thing I didn't mention on the screen. Does anyone know what this default project is here? And how it is not the default project that you set in Solution Explorer? Is anyone here familiar with that?
Basically, it's going to add the references in that project, right?
So this is so you were saying that it's going to add the references there. What it does is it identifies where your migrations reside. So when you enable migrations, your project, all your projects don't have the migration. One of them does. So by default, I have two projects in my sample. One is my main MVC web project, and I didn't complicate it by adding additional domain assemblies or other layers. I have just two layers in my sample, the web project and the DAO layer. In the DAO layer, that's where the migrations exist. So in order for it to run the migrations, it needs to know where these reside. And if you don't change it, if you forget to change it, you'll get a little nasty error that tells you couldn't find any migrations. And this happens more often than not. Every time you run a migration, you hear someone laughing in the room because another developer forgot to change it. Oh, I forgot to change it again. So this always defaults to whatever your default web project is, or maybe it was on top of the list, but it's always not the one that I want. So I always have to manually change this. And once you change it, it becomes second nature. Any questions, concern on this so far before we move to the next line? Question?
Any of these like source control, I mean, like when you say add middle name with the migration history, can you put that in TFS or?
Yes. So the question was, can you put this all in TFS? So the migration file is a physical file with .NET code. That's C#. So not only can you put in source control, you absolutely have to put in source control. That's the way you share it with everyone else. And as I get through the end of these slides, I'll explain how this can all be not only stored, but also shared with others in your team. Okay? So slide 5 here is push your code and migrate your server database. There's actually two separate steps here. So when you push your code, this is Happy Developer here, push your code. And I've mentioned Mercurial here, it's one of my favorites. You might be using Git, maybe even Subversion or TFS, hopefully not. And hopefully not source it. So, how many people here have actually used SourceSafe in the past?
You mean
All right.
at all?
Yes, at
Or
all.
lately?
At all. Lately? Anyone lately? Hopefully not. All right. If you use SourceSafe 6.0 lately, and if you'd like to try something new, here Excella is hiring, so I've actually left a lot of business cards out there. So afterwards, if you want to grab one, feel free to contact me. And if you do get up yourself to grab a business card, feel free to grab a couple if you want to pass them around. So let's say you push your code. Now, what actually goes in there? Your application code, your model code, any migrations you may have added, but not the SQL code, because that's automatically generated. If you wish to generate the SQL code and actually retain it, that's not something you'd like to, or you'd have to check into source control, because that can be always generated with migration. So let's say this developer pulls it. What happens after that? The developer would then update their database, because now there's a new migration path. They don't have to add migrations themselves. It's already been added to the system. They'll run the update database command in their local system, and it'll add any migrations that are still pending. Let's say they forget to update their own database. What will happen is they might be working on something, and they've added new model code themselves. And let's say after that, they try to add a new migration for their own change. The system will actually detect that and tell them, you have pending migrations. So in case you're trying to update your own database with the new migration you just added, and someone else didn't add a migration, but they've changed a model, then you'll know that someone else forgot to add a migration. Now, the way to get around this is you could, in theory, add a migration for them, but it's up to the developer who made a model change to add the migration themselves. So you need to make sure that if you've added some model changes, which deserves its own migration, add it yourself. If you see someone else has forgotten to do so, remind them so that they add the migration. You can pull their latest code, and all you have to do is update database. All you have to do to update your own database for other people's changes is to run update database. You shouldn't have to add migrations for other people. The last part here is team sitting. You can use any other CI tool that you want. It's one of my personal favorites. And I've mentioned migrate.exe. Now, this is a tool that comes with Entity Framework, and it can be deployed along with your application, or it can just sit on the server. And it actually updates your server or your shared databases. It essentially does the same thing that you do manually in your machine, but every time you check in your code, you can update Team City to run a command. And if you don't do this yourself, you might have a configuration manager to take care of this for you. But this is another way to make sure your server is also updated. If you don't have this step, you will have to manually log into the server remotely and run migrate.exe yourself. That's not something you want to do. Also, from your local machine, you could connect to the remote server and then run update database yourself. Again, that becomes manual. Yes, question?
At one point, maybe it was Entity Framework 3, maybe 4, you could, the startup, Bootstrap, or however you global ASAX, whatever, however the application started, you could put code in your application start event.
Yes.
To do that migration. Can you still do that?
Yeah. So at the beginning, there was we saw in the database code there was a flag to automatically do this. We turned it off on purpose. Okay. So instead of having you do it automatically, it does. You should use this tool instead. It's built for migrations, and it takes care of it if there's something to migrate. And if there's nothing to migrate, it won't mess up your system.
Okay. So this is in place of the auto migrations.
That's still there. You could still auto migrate. And one of the links that I provide, I think it's on MSDN, it actually tells you why you shouldn't do that. So I'll explain in one of the later slides. And finally, we have the process workflow. So before I go into additional topics, the last part of the main topics I wanted to discuss was the communication between the dev team and the DB architects. Now, I had hinted at this earlier. It's very difficult to work with people who just disagree with you fundamentally. You might have to get a mediator just to make sure you can agree on something. But what we were able to do using migrations is when we had things like the table mapping, we were able to let them set up whatever table names they wanted, and we were able to name our tables differently. So let's say they want a table name to be a certain way, they want to have prefixes and suffixes and all sorts of weird syntax, underscores and whatnot. We were able to get around that by not having to name our entities the same as the database tables.
Well, I don't know what drugs you were giving your DB architects, but it's almost like you're trying to I can visualize this conversation.
Yes.
Hey, okay, we're going to design the database in C# code, it's going to come to you. And then they get nervous about their whole career choice. And if you come to them and you say, well, look, it's cool, man, because you can name the tables whatever you want, that can't be the end of your story, right?
Right. No, there's more. These are client projects I'm talking about, so.
I mean, if the project's small, it's not a big deal.
Right, it was a pretty big project. It still is. So.
Okay.
And those guys who are smiling there in the corner are my partners in crime, and without them, actually, none of this would have been possible. So.
Well, they're very intimidating. I can see how you guys won.
So this still goes on to this day. But another thing down here is things like column names. So this allows, I mentioned earlier that your ID can be extracted out into a base class. So what you can also do is, even though all the entities are called ID within this base class, within the database, let's say you have a humans table, maybe the DBA wants to call it humans ID or human ID. So this allows you to do that. So you can map each field, which is here, to a string value that's hard-coded to be whatever your database field name is. So this lets you then make them happy, and they don't really care what's in your code. All right?
Just to speak to that concern a little bit, there's definitely lots of value in getting an EV architect's input into your plan design. And we do change. Sometimes when you push things through code, the database design does not really appear the way a DB architect might design it. And it is important to have that conversation because there are ways through the mapping process to change the design so that it is more optimal. So there's definitely absolute value in the architect process.
And also to add to that, not only that, you don't have access to, or you might not have regular access to all the developers from other teams, but that guy does. So let's say if he and his team, however small it is, has access to all the development teams, we might be doing things that are inconsistent with each other, and he makes sure that people are in sync, or at least helps us understand what the other team is. So
one final point, not to do that motion thing. You're right, DBAs aren't generally particularly happy by moving this away from them, but at the same time, you can point to the value that's gained by the dev team being able to iterate quickly and make database changes on the fly as necessary, and then having a review process afterwards. And even if they don't see the value, your PM, Scrum Master, whatever you want to call it, in our case, our client, will. And they will tell them that, no, they're right, you just need to make sure that they're designing it properly.
Well, and we were able to go to production much more quickly using this technology, and I was able to leverage the database developers to help migrate the data from the old system. Mm-hmm. So it was very successful.
Yeah. It's not that we're feeding our DBAs any bugs, it's just that the client wants.
yes.
If I recall correctly, like in Hibernate, you have configuration files that does this mapping for you.
Yes.
Is that possible in a framework as well?
Yes and no. Because since we didn't use it in Hibernate on this project, but I know what you're saying. Basically, you want to make sure that things that are in your code map to things that are in your database. So since we're using fluid mapping here, we're not using configuration files to do mapping. But I'm actually on a different project right now, and it's a legacy project that actually does use an Hibernate and uses mapping files. They're huge. All right, so now it's time for the code walkthrough. So as you know, in every demo, sometimes the demo doesn't work, in which case I actually left everything I wanted to show in this slide right here, but hopefully the demo will work exactly as designed. Just want to talk through it really quick. So here you see my human class again, and I'm going to be adding this middle name in there. I'll show how you can add a new migration, and it will generate a new migration here. And I'll explain in a second what up and down means. And the second part of it is that you run update database, and it applies the migration to your database, and it actually adds a new field name. So to answer my earlier question, if I don't specify any of these string lengths here, they all become nvarchar max. You probably don't want that. So what you can do is you can add string length there. That's one of the data annotations that I'll get into. Again, not required per se. And notice how the primary key that got generated is the ID, and it's a non-null field type thing. So let me go ahead and set up the sample. I'm going to pull it over to the screen here. So while that's coming up here, the up and down methods that refers to moving up to higher versions of database and going down to lower version. And when you generate a migration, in this case, when I added a new field, it added add column command in the up method, which just shows that when someone updates to this version, it'll add the column. And it auto-generates a down method as well, because for whatever reason, you might want to move back one version or several versions. You can ask the system to target a specific migration, and you can also ask it to go back to the first version, in which case it'll use all the down methods. So now I will pull this over here. Actually, you know what? I shouldn't have used clone. I should have used clone systems. So let me just change my desktop settings so I can actually look at my screen here. So now you should be seeing the same thing as I am, okay? All right, so down here is the package manager console that I was talking about earlier. So if you go into tool, if I remember correctly, library package manager, and there's your package manager console, okay? So if you're looking for the package manager console, the Pac-Man, as some people like to call it, that's where it is. So here I have two projects here, patient records and Dell. Now you'll notice that patient record is bold because I've set this to be the default project. Now if I run it in Chrome, it's going to start building the project. And it should pull up my web app in a few seconds. Now I just used a basic MVC4 template. It doesn't really do much except for having a link to the list of human records. And it should go ahead and connect to it. And as you notice, it's just a basic template which has absolutely nothing, but the application runs. So we'll go ahead and add a couple of things here. Let's go ahead and stop it. And I have some notes here so I can cheat out of these. So basically this one has no migrations added. How do I know this? Because I added this Dell assembly, and here's an empty migrations folder. Now I've added models here too. There's that one human class. And I've also cheated by putting in my middle name there. And then in my mapping folder, I've added a human map. So here's the things you need to add. So I mentioned three different things here. One is each of your entities need to be added as a separate class. The second part is you need to have one DB context, which derives from DB context, and it has a DB set for each of your entities. And you have to add a new line to add the configuration for each of your maps. What does this map file look like? As I showed you earlier, it maps the ID field as a primary key, and it maps to the table name. If you don't have humans, it'll call it human, as I mentioned. So the first thing I want to do is I want to enable migrations. So how do I get this name? It's the command, followed by the flag, followed by the namespace and class name of my command. So now, yes, question?
You're about to run this in the package manager console.
That's correct.
And that's essentially a PowerShell command. Why can't I run this in the PowerShell command?
I don't know the answer to that. Does anyone? I've seen some nodding heads over there who says you can.
You can, okay. I'd be surprised if you couldn't, but every example I've seen of this has always been, it always seemed to me that doing this in the package manager console was the wrong place for it, because I want to run commands in package manager that gets me, downloads assemblies for me, puts them in the right place. And I would rather have another interface that didn't say package manager. I mean,
right.
I guess they could change the name and full name. So I don't know, something like. I mean, I like the fact that you're typing commands though. I was just curious to see if there was a way to maybe
Great. So again, it's very open-ended. You can choose to do however you want. Do you have another comment?
You can do all of this in Package Manager. They tell you to do it in, PowerShell. They tell you to do it in Package Manager because it starts off in the right place. If you watch Julie Lerman's video on this on Pluralsight, it goes into a little bit of the details about like, well, yeah, you can actually do this in PowerShell as well.
Right, to import the right.
I'm sorry.
You probably import the right assemblies and stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So Sal mentioned the name of Julie Lerman. So when we were learning about migrations, we hadn't worked with it before. We went to pluralsight.com and watched her video. It was super helpful. And when I tweeted earlier this week about, or was it maybe last, yeah, it was sometime last week, about this presentation that I was doing in Cap Area, I got a retweet from Julie Lerman herself. So obviously I got her, I guess she vouched for this, so that's good.
You must feel really good. And
So let me go ahead and run this command. So hopefully this will work, but it won't. And let me tell you why. See this drop down here? Oops, let me put this back in. So this drop down here, I did not select the project that has the context type. So I added this context type in the DAL project. Hit enter again. And now it's actually doing something. So the yellow stuff is good. If it's red, it's bad. So right now, it has actually opened the configuration that it added. So I just installed ReSharper on this machine after I created this project. You'll see a bunch of these. So you can always remove them if you want. Make it cleaner. And down here as well. All right, so I mentioned earlier that it creates this default text to add a new item. So obviously you don't have to use this. And I don't even have this person class here, so I can't be using this. Also, automatic migration enabled is set to false. I would like to leave that as false. But now it has created my migration for me. So what else did it do? So let's go to the migration folder. Initially, this was empty. So now we see that it's got this configuration file that I have open right here. And I also have initial create. Let's go into that one. So here you'll notice a couple of things. There's your up method, and there's your down method. The down method is pretty easy. This is the initial version of it. I just added a new table. So all it will do, if I want to revert this, it will drop that table. And someone mentioned earlier, are you going to lose your data? If you go back a version, let's say you update this, update to this version, add your seed data, and then you manually added some sample data, or you even use your application to add new items. You would get some new data in there, and next time if you run migration that goes backwards, it'll run this down method, it'll drop that table, and you would lose that data. So anything you do has to be intentional.
Suppose you do a migration where you're just adding like the middle name thing that you're talking about.
Yes.
And you add it and you updated it. So when you do your if you do the down on that, what will happen with the data?
You would lose. So let's say, so that's a good question. So what if you do a migration and you only added a new, so new migration I'll add after this, I'll add a middle name. So if I then added new data that has middle name values in there, and later on I would like to move back one, I'll probably do that as a deliberate decision. If I'm removing the middle name column, chances are I don't want the middle name in there. So you would lose your data, that's correct. And if you say, oh, wait a second, but I want the middle names, well, then don't delete your middle name column. Good question. So you'll notice here I have ID, SSN, first name, and last name. And notice there's some other properties here. These get added in by default. Nullable false and identity true. It knows identity is true because I had that in the mapping. Nullable is false, again, because it's a primary key. And it doesn't have any additional values for string lengths because we didn't add those yet. So let's actually look at the database to see what we have here. So here is our human table. And I'm just going to run the update database to see if we get the seed data in there. And let me actually open this and show you what it looks like. So here, as you can see, everything's null. There's no data. So I'm going to run update database. So I mentioned you can see the SQL script for this. The command for that is script. So what that will do is it'll let me know whether there are anything to add or not. So there's no script right now because I already updated my database initially. There's nothing to add. We'll run this again in a second after we add the middle name. So what good will it do if I run update database itself if there's no scripts to run? What it'll do is it'll run their seed data. Let's go ahead and run that. So notice it says no pending code base migrations, but it did run my seed data. So let's check this out again. And it has not refreshed. So let me, oh, you know why? Because I never added my seed data. That's a very good test. So I do have some cheat text over here, and this actually includes the middle name. So I won't run this right now. Basically, if I were to run this and just remove the middle name, actually, why not? Let's just do it. So let's do this. And go back to configuration. Oops. Didn't mean to do that. This is like all of it. There we go. So I need to add a couple of usings there. And see how it knows that there's no middle name. Let's take that out. Let's compile that. All right, build succeeded. So what happens if I run update database now? Running seed method. Hopefully this time it'll do something useful, right? And there we go. We have our first name, last name, and there it is. So if I didn't have the SSN as identified as the key, every time I run this, it would keep adding new records in there. So we definitely don't want that. So let's actually go ahead and add the middle name. So the next thing is I'm going to add a migration called added middle name. But let's say I haven't even updated my model yet. What happens if I try to do this? It created a blank migration for me. Now this is perfectly legit. I can go ahead and generate a SQL statement for this, which will be nothing. But there might be a reason why you want to do this. So who can tell me why you would generate an empty migration? So I'll go ahead and answer that. I don't see any hands. So if you had existing tables in a database, and you just started adding all your models to it, and you've added some new models, when you generate this migration, it'll add all these create table statements for you. But you can't run that on your database. So what you do is then you would either comment those out or delete them and add an empty migration to keep EF migrations happy. Because otherwise, there's new things to be added, but you need to be able to add a migration to show that you've added something new. But since it's a one-way process, it no longer knows that you actually commented it. So you're being sneaky around it. But that's one way to get around using an existing system. So I don't want to add yet another migration just for the middle name, so I can actually delete this right here. No harm done. It's like it never happened. If I just added a migration, I can take it after. So let's go into our human and add this back in. So I can hit the up arrow here and say add migration, add a middle name, and it does exactly what you expect. There's my new column right there, and it created a down method just for me, right? But let's go here and say open table definition. In my MDF file, I'm going to load that in a second. You should notice that you still have, you can see it on the left as well, but I wanted to show you in the design window. And while that's loading, okay, so it's loaded now. You'll notice that it's not there yet, right? So if I run the update database command, now it'll run the migration for me. It'll add the middle name, and it'll also run the seed method. So now you'll notice that it's got it mentioned by name. So I mentioned earlier you have the prefix with the timestamp on it, and there's your initial create, and there's your added middle name. So let's go ahead and refresh that. And on the left, you should see it appear. Take a look at the data. And there it is. Everyone has no middle name. So who can tell me why I don't have any middle names here? You got creative with just,
well, it didn't even rerun the seed because
yes.
the SSNs were already dead.
It did run the seed. What you said? What did you say, sir?
Well, I was saying is you would provide value to seed.
That's correct. I didn't provide the value in the seed. So it does run the seed every time. So if I go back here, remember the middle name that I added? So let's go back to my configuration. There's your seed. Actually, I'll probably just undo this. There you go. So now it's already there, so now this should compile. And I will run the update database again. So now there's no pending code base migrations, but if we go to the data, should be able to refresh that. And there we go, middle name's there. So you can run the seed data as many times as you want. What the SSN key does is let it know that it's going to be unique for the system, even though we do have the primary key. All right, does anyone have any questions so far? I see a question in the back.
If you bring up the table again, or the data,
Yes.
your middle name is now at the end.
Yes.
Some OCD people like me want to have them in order.
Yes.
Is there ways to reorder the columns?
Let me think about that for a second. So I just added it as a later column, so it added it to the end. As far as you're adding a new column towards after the fact, I'm not sure how you can reorganize the addition of the columns without having to actually drop the table. I don't want to go that far, but you're right. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
But as you know for a fact, if you're adding new column, actually, let me ask the room this. So if you have an existing system, let's say you weren't doing migrations at all, you're just working with your SQL database. You're adding new columns and it gets added to the end. What would you do to solve that? You want to add it in the middle. What would you normally do?
I might go into the designer and reorder it in the design part.
There you
You
go.
will need the designer actually drops your table and recreates it. So depending on the size of that table, that might be something to work on. Right?
So again, it depends on how you want it. Hopefully the order might not matter to you because when you run your select command, you can order the select columns in whatever way you want. In fact, you can have the middle name column appear 10 times in between every column. So hopefully that will fix your problem when you can just do select the
Some
way
of
you
the
want.
newer versions of the SQL Designer actually have that disabled. So if you do a change that forces the dropping of the table, it actually doesn't work. You have to go into tools options and enable that for it to make this purge.
One thing, so if you're working with SQL Server, there's a data called syscolumn. Take it and the master, you can open it and it has a field column there. You have to manually do it.
All right. So yes.
Will you be covering foreign keys?
I will, yes. So I left relationships out of this because, as you can see, this was an intro course. Most people here have not used migrations before. Wanted to keep it. This was designed to be an intro course migrations, and I'll be covering relationships shortly.
And just one more thing: when you're adding the middle name, what by chance that we say it is not nullable?
You can add that as well.
But what happens to the records that are already in?
If you want to add a new field that's not nullable, you better have some data for it as well.
But how does it work? I mean, because it adds the column first, and then I think...
C data is different from default data. You can define default data as you create it. Go on, Aslan.
So when your migrations are automatically created for you, you can actually still insert, tell it to run a SQL script before running the migration itself. So if you're making the middle name non-nullable, then you could actually insert a SQL statement before that to insert all the data, and then it would actually run that first, and then.
So let's say I have this, right? You probably don't want to keep that in your script because you're just creating a new table, automatically delete it. Or maybe you do. Maybe you want to create a new table. But that doesn't make any sense. I mean, obviously you don't want to, if you've just created a table, it doesn't contain anything yet. But let's see what that generates. So let's say I want to say add migration, and let's say, actually no, not add migration, it's update database. So the migration is already there. And as far as Visual Studio is concerned, is whole EF migration system, it thinks your migration's already been generated. But we've manually changed something here, right? So let's say it's still compiled. I'm going to run add update database, but I want to see what kind of SQL it generates. So the migration's already being added, so it's saying no pending code-based migrations. So let's go ahead and revert that, right? So let's say I want to say update database, target migration, and I want to say initial create. I think this is the syntax. So notice how I didn't have to mention the entire name with the prefix on it. So now it's actually reverting it. So if I refresh this, it actually ran the down method. If you recall, I had the down method that says drop humans table. And now I would like to update this database and see what it thinks I need to update. So notice I've reverted the database. So it went back to previous version, but the code itself still has the extra migration right here, right? I have initially created and I added middle name. So what's going to happen when I do this? So it's like I never ran update database before. So this is very interesting. So you're going to see 3 lines here. The first line is alter table, add middle name, right? So this is the SQL that it generates for this migration. And there's a manual SQL that I add. So Dohan mentioned you can add SQL code directly in there. So what did I do in my configuration? I'm sorry, not in my configuration, in my migration itself. Add this one SQL code. And you can add any valid SQL statement there. And it generated this line. So anything you'd like to add in addition to this auto-generated SQL, you add that. So what is that third line there? It says insert into __ migration history. So you don't really care what that says. All it is, there's only 1, 2, 3, 4 columns there. And it contains this metadata so it knows what version it's on. So beneath this giant line here, you notice it also has this 5.00.NET 4.5 for the Entity Framework version, which is this. So these 3 columns here that get filled out is generated automatically. And one of the processes that we followed was when we communicated with our DBAs and the architects, we had to send them this auto-generate SQL script. So that's why this came in handy. We generate the SQL with the script function, and we send them all of this above the inserting. So they don't really care what this says. We send them at least the upper portion, just so they could look at how things were getting generated. So the links that I'll provide you, you can get more details on how to change things to have additional values. We put a comma there. You'll notice that I can add additional items here as well. I can change the string length for something, but that's not something you do here. If I go back into my model, let's go back to the human class. So let's say you want your last name to have a string length. Okay. Sorry, you can't type. And oops, let me do that. So here, what it did was I used ReSharper to add system.componentModel.data annotations. And here, I can put in a value over here, right? So let's say I wanted to say 10, right? That actually counts as adding a new migration. So if I were to say add migration, changed length, it says unable to generate explicit migration because the following explicit migrations are pending. So basically, I haven't updated the last update yet. So if I do update database, it'll update it for me. Oh, you know what? So I see what happened here. I have now reproduced the scenario where one person has added something and someone else has added something. I've done both of them myself. So let me actually take that out for now. So I'll copy this part right here. I'll take that out. And let's build that. And let's click run update database. So now it's set the no pending code base migration, right? So if I say add migration, so I haven't added the change length yet, but I'm going to see if it generates something. So here there's nothing to add, so that's good. Let me go ahead and delete that. And add that back in. And we'll add a new migration for that. So now it's added a migration. So in here you'll notice that it has additional properties. So I don't have to memorize these property names. I just use a string length attribute and it generates this for me. And it says that my max length is 10. Now if I want to run an update database on it with the -script flag, it'll generate actual SQL code that then tells me ultra column, last name, and record 10. So what happens if I run it without the dash script? Runs it again, and now it ran change length. So let's go ahead and refresh that. Let's open table definition. I can open this while it's loading again. So notice that the last name is now in record 10. So anything you want to change, you can add it by attributes, and that should take care of that. So I don't want to save to SQL. As I mentioned, you don't need to put it into source control. So up next, we have making migrations work. So in a real world, you try to do all this stuff, and you run into all these problems. So fortunately, I've come up with a couple of points here that might help you in your journey. Discuss upcoming changes with teams. So if I'm working with not only my own team, but with other teams, just let them know, I'm about to add 5 tables here. Is that a problem? And let's say someone else says, well, I'm about to add 2 tables. What is it that you're adding? It turns out they're adding 2 of the same tables that you wanted to add. So maybe you can collaborate on that and have them add the 2 tables, you can add the other 3. This also helps the other external non-developers learn about what you're trying to add. Next you have inspect or update your migration code. So we just took a live look at what it means to add migrations and edit it on the fly. You saw how it created a scenario where I added something, I didn't update my migration, I didn't update my database, I couldn't run it because it said they were pending migration. These are problems you'll have all the time. People forget, people make mistakes, but as you saw very quickly, within seconds, everything was resolved. In the real world, of course, you can resolve everything within seconds, right? Hopefully you'll have more time to work with others to resolve any issues that come up. But inspecting the migration code definitely helps. Next, update your own DB before checking. Now you could do all this stuff on your machine and say, oh, you know what, I just added a new string length. Everything's fine. I'm just going to go ahead and check this out. Someone else pulls that locally and they update their database and they lose all this data or something bad happens. In this case, you can break your own system first before you break someone else's. That way, you have no one to blame but yourself. Also, use the dash script flag to see the SQL code first. It helps you know what you're getting into. And finally, run migrate.exe after deployments. So this is on the server. We have server deployments I've mentioned earlier. This comes with Entity Framework. The packages folder in your NuGet folder. Does everyone know what NuGet is? All right. It contains Entity Framework 5.0, and there's a tools folder there that contains migrate.exe. What we did on our project is we had deployed migrate.exe with the server as well, and set up a TeamCity step to run that. I had mentioned the upgrade or downgrade. So how do those up and down methods get called? When I said target migration and gave the migration name, or selected the default project, it went directly back to the migration, deleted my table. If you wanted to migrate all the way back to version 0, you can tell it to do version 0 or use $initial database. These two are the same. It'll just get you all the way back to what you had before. And finally, you have the migration history table. This is what it looks like. It's got a couple of fields here. It actually changed between version 4 and version 5 of Entity Framework. I don't think it's changing again with 6, but it's you don't have to worry about what's in it. I forget which one the screenshot is from. I just got it from a Google search. But basically, it keeps track of all your migration. You shouldn't have to ever worry about this. So all your migration history is stored there. It's your metadata for your migrations. And every time you add a new migration, you get a new record. And it gets automatically generated, so don't worry about changing any of this. And finally, it can be used for upgrades and downgrades. Any questions on the migration history table? All right. So a project is not a real project without issues, right? So just like FAQ for a website, we have common issues. So this one we actually demonstrated today. Pushing model change without adding a migration. Others will see a pending migrations. Maybe I will see it myself. So we'll make sure that no one's waiting around for you. Make sure you add your migrations for all your changes. Using an existing database, common issue is you're using an existing one. What are you going to do after you add new models for existing tables? We've also talked about this. Use an empty migration if you have one. because if you just added new models, it'll create up and down methods to create and drop those tables. And you definitely want to make sure you take those out. And finally, customizing your constraint forms. You can manually edit your migration code. I showed you how to add string length in the model itself. But what if there's something where you want to change the foreign key? I've provided a link in a later slide that shows you how you can add additional items. You can change what the foreign key will be named if you have to comply with requirements. So the additional topics that I won't really go into as we're approaching 8:30 here. I want to touch on those because I know we had some questions. So relationships and attributes. So one slide for relationships. So here, I actually stole this off the previous project we had all worked on together. I provided a link to it. It's called Excella Lean. And the first time I'd done this presentation at Nova Code Camp, we had presented this larger project, and it had several tables and several entities. So here, there's two things here. If you look at the two models, the reservation and request. So they're all coming out of this entity base that's a shared class that I mentioned. It has the ID property. That's why you don't see ID in any of these. And this person. You'll notice the example of string length in here too. So these are the attributes. But what I wanted to show you was the relationships. So in the mapping file, the example that I showed you, the relationships block was empty. Here, it shows you that for the mapping file of every reservation request, this requester is actually a person ID, actually a person, and it maps to this field. So it knows the type of the person because see this requester variable here? This is a type person, and it maps to this field. So notice that this is in quotes, because this is actually the field name in the database itself. So in the mapping for that person table, if it's mapped to this specific name, you need to map it to whatever the field name will be in the database. I also wanted to touch on foreign keys. So let's say this gets auto-generated and you don't see any name foreign key. To rename it, you just have to include a name property. So right after you add migration, before you update database, you can change this to use any foreign key name that you want. This goes for all constraints. If you'd like to name things, you have to change this. One word of warning.
Does it add a name by default, or
it does add a name by default. So if you don't care about what the name is, you don't have to do this stuff. If you have to comply with requirements where it has to be named a certain way, this is an optional thing to do. So one word of warning. This is only in the up method, and the down method is going to drop the foreign key. So for any constraints that are added that you've manually changed, you have to go in the down method and make sure you remove those or update those so that they get removed correctly. Because here, it would get added with this name. Later on, the drop method, you might not spot this until someone tries to downgrade. It won't work unless you fix it.
Question, you can cascade update, cascade delete as part of the foreign key?
Yes, you do. So again, if you look at the documentation for add foreign key, you can see what other options you have. And there are things like even for the columns, there's nullables. So
you can also set common rules on what should be done on your relationships, on your registration, where you register your mappings. You can set it to the by default to do a cascade delete or by default to not do it.
And these are things that you should communicate with the team as you do it, so everyone's aware of what's being done automatically. And the other item was attributes. So this one, I pulled it up MSDN. You have these two classes here, book and person. You'll notice that person has a collection of books. So here, I've updated it, or rather the person who wrote the post in MSDN has updated it to include all these attributes. You've seen some of these before. You see their relationships here as well. So these are things that you can add. So I know in our project we've had problems with just having fluid mappings. We have to add attributes as well. Your experience may vary, but the link that I provided in the next slide, actually it's in the last slide, will have these options. Yes?
Hey, going back to your previous slide, just when you have those collections and things like that, if you make a virtual function, it's delayed loading.
Yes. Yes, so the comment was that if you use virtual, it's delayed loading. So you can have, depending on how you want things loaded, you can have it set up that way.
Yes, so you bring the main record, you're not bringing the whole collection.
Yep, that's correct. And then, because in real life, you'll have complex objects when objects contain other objects as well. So, in conclusion, Code first migrations. It helps you do continuous development. You don't have to wait for this one DBA person to set up your database. You do it yourself in your own code. Your dev team is now synchronized. You push your code throughout the day, and everything gets updated. People pull their code, and they can update their own database. Database versioning. It's automated. Every time you add a new migration, it has its own version. We didn't really solve the problem with an infinite number of migrations where we had one migrations folder with all our migrations. And finally, we have server deployments with migrate.exe. You can automate that as well. So with that, I'll show you my downloads section on my website, wakeupandcode.com/downloads. This is already on the site, so if you go there on your favorite device, and you can pull the PowerPoint, this PowerPoint from there. And the patient records, I've added 2 versions of it. One was the complete version where I've already added the migration, and one is the incomplete version. So if you forget how to do all of those steps, I actually had an older blog post that I just recently revised to include everything that I just mentioned. That's useful. And not to forget, troubleshooting the sample. Some of you may have this issue. I found Stack Overflow question about this, where if you take your project, upload it to a server or a network drive, download it to another machine, migration stopped working. You run enable migration, it says not a valid command. First, I thought there was something wrong with my machine, but I was able to follow these steps here just by clearing the NuGet package and rebuilding my solution. It just worked. So normally you won't have this problem on your own machine. It's with putting something on a server, bringing it back. For whatever reason, it flukes out. So hopefully that will fix your problem. If you have any questions, I have all these online resources here that I've mentioned. This is the a couple of MSDN links, a couple of blog links, and the Pluralsight video. And finally, the troubleshooting, Stack Overflow. And I've now provided my email address as well as my website and Twitter. So that's it for the presentation.
Okay.
Yes. So for those of you who don't have the opportunity to capture this slide on your phone, it's also part of the presentation that's in the download section, so you can download it immediately. And I'll leave this up for a second if you want to add me on Twitter or send me. All right.